Thanks everyone for coming. We're delighted to have Mark Glusky with us. He's just written a book, Faster, Higher, Stronger. People around here like books like this because it looks a little bit like Ben Horowitz's book. Right? I mean, there's nothing, and I don't want to say anything, but this sold pretty well. And
well, let's hope it helps. We'll take all the help we can get color scheme.
Yeah. You're an editor at Wired, but have also been a journalist at a number of sports concepts. Can you give a brief career of the career trajectory and how you came to write the book?
So my joke is this is bringing together the. I'm trying to bridge the nerd-jock divide here.
Okay.
I started my career at Sports Illustrated, where I covered baseball and college football, and helped launch SI's first website way back when people were launching their first websites.
Yeah.
And worked there for a while, and then moved out here, worked at Electronic Arts, where I launched some editorial products there, and have been at Wired for 9 years. So it's really, I grew up wanting to be a sports writer, and now I'm a technology editor. And
you just go back and forth between the nerd and the, which is great. So the premise of the book is that there's been massive improvement in athletic performance due to our better understanding of our body and how they can be trained, as best I can tell. So it's hacking your body.
It is. We over the past 100 years, our performance, if you look at things like the 100-meter freestyle, we're 49% faster than we were in 1909. Some women's field events are actually, we've had more than 100% performance improvement in those events. What's interesting is that curve's starting to flatten out a little bit.
Yeah.
That we've had this century of unbelievable physical achievement, and a lot of that comes from just really understanding some of the basic science in ways that we never knew it before. Now, and I think one of the points I try and really illuminate in the book is to find sort of marginal gains over your competition, you have to look much deeper. You have to look towards science and technology and towards not just doing the basics right, which is still incredibly important and surprisingly gets wrong a lot of the time, even at the elite level, but really finding those little improvements through really sort of cutting-edge, crazy techniques.
Yeah, you've got a line that I thought was interesting and somewhat depressing. Today's great innovations are tomorrow's baseline. So the ante for athletic performance keeps going up, but then you're still competing. You're competing now with everyone who's
I mean, if you watch game tape of like an NBA game from the 50s or 60s, if you watch the Celtics from the 60s, who many people acknowledge as like the greatest team ever.
It's hysterical.
It's hysterical. Yeah. You see these guys taking sort of like 15-foot hook shots and like just sort of like
set shots.
Look, if you can consistently make a 15-foot hook shot, that's amazing. But
he just fell off with the consistent. So
So we have some hoops players.
Yeah, we have a few.
It's just such a different universe that we're competing in now. And it's just that ante goes up a little bit every year. And once you stack year over year, it's the same thing that we all face in all the things that we do business-wise, right? That, if we could morph ourselves back to 1996 and launch a website, we'd be in pretty good shape, right? Because we've learned a whole lot. But at the time, it seemed like, that things were pretty cool what we were doing. Now we'd laugh at it.
They were fast. It was high-paced.
Exactly.
Nature versus nurture. Can anyone train themselves to be a world-class athlete?
No.
Could I do it?
No.
No. I think.
I mean, that's.
Want to be clear.
Nature versus nurture is this never-ending debate in science, and we love the narrative that anybody can do anything because we want to believe that, and we want to encourage our kids that they can be or do anything they want. When it comes to elite athletic performance, there's this tension. There's a certain level of genetic endowment that you have to have, and without that, you're not going to be competitive at the elite level. Like. This level is so far beyond normal. This isn't about just sort of like being a good runner or being a decent golfer. I'm an okay golfer, and somebody who's a scratch golfer looks at me like I'm a joke, right? So multiply that by like 20, and you're at the worst player on the PGA Tour, and multiply that by another 20, and you're at the best player on the PGA Tour. One biologist talks about genetics as the size of the bucket that you possess, and work and training as how high you fill that bucket. So the best genetics don't always win, but they're sort of the cost of entry.
Yeah. And conversely, can anyone be a world-class athlete these days without using these training techniques?
I think it's really hard to be. I mean, I think it's probably easier to be a world-class athlete with great genetics and bad training than it is to be a world-class athlete with bad genetics and great training, if that makes sense.
No, which is there. So, starting to age, are great athletes born? You have some interesting examples in the book of where genetics seem pretty powerful.
Yeah, genetics seem to make the most difference in sports that are really physiologically determined. So running, cycling, rowing, things that really, there are tactics and there is training, but a lot of it comes down to sort of how much oxygen you can process and how your muscles work. Team sports, things that require a lot of skill, seem to sort of border more on the training side, but there's always a balance there. But, to use Gladwell's phrase, these guys are outliers, but there are people who have won world championships in the high jump 3 years after they high jumped for the first time. That's crazy.
That is crazy.
That's insane. Beating thousands of people who spent their whole life doing this. There are people who won Olympic rowing gold medals 2 years after sitting in a boat for the first time. They were great athletes in other sports, and there have been really cool things that the UK has done, especially to try and find athletes in other sports and put them in a sport that's better suited to their athletic abilities and talents.
Describe that. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, so Helen Glover is this woman's name. She was a field hockey player in the UK, and she was a good field hockey player, but not a great one. The UK, in the run-up to the London Olympics, ran a program, and I love the name of it. It was called Sporting Giants. And what they did is they put out a call for tall athletes. Height's a real advantage in some sports, and one of them is rowing because basically you're a lever. Like the physics of it is just a longer lever's better, all other things being equal. Yeah. So she saw her mom actually saw a newspaper advertisement for this program. She went, she interviewed, they did sort of an initial screen, then they did physiological testing on about 1,000 athletes, male and female. A couple hundred went into a training program, and 3 years later, she won a gold medal in London with her partner Heather Standing in the pairs rowing,
which is kind of cool. The bobsleds had a few of those too. Herschel Walker, I think.
Herschel Walker was Lolo Jones, who was a sprinter, was in the bobsled. Lauren Williams, another sprinter. Yeah, some of those things, like a bobsled push athlete, you run and push. There's not a lot of skill. Right. The driver, on the other hand, spends decades honing his or her craft, trying to figure out how to get that thing done.
But then flipping back to genetics, the two winners of the New York Marathon this year again were Kenyan. So
sure.
What happens in East Africa?
That is a great. I mean, if I could answer that question, so I think people can conflate genetics with other things. So there are things genetically determined, like body size and height, that East African runners tend to have. They're pretty small. Yep. They have really thin calves. There have been some interesting research on the one thing in running is obviously how fast you can swing your legs and how much energy that takes, and the lighter the leg, the better. That's why Oscar Pistorius was actually able to be competitive, because he had a very light leg. Because it was made out of carbon fiber. Yep. But there are other factors. The fact that the Rift Valley sits at over 2,000 meters of altitude. Yep. And so everybody's living at high altitude. People move all over the U.S. to live at altitude and train. The fact that there's a culture that really values running as not just a mode of transportation, but as sort of like the highest athletic aspiration. It's the equivalent of making it to the NFL or NBA or Major League Baseball in the States. And the fact that you really have a culture that has developed around identifying good runners young and starting to train them. Yeah. And frankly, some of the things we've seen is perhaps a culture that's willing to cut some corners when it comes to pharmacology.
We'll come back to that topic. Because there has to be hope for me.
we augment it. So, I think everybody wants to find a really simple answer to that question. If we'd been having this conversation in the 1930s, you would have said, like, why do Finnish runners win every middle distance event? Finns dominated basically from the 800 to the 10,000 meters for 40 years. Like things like the top 7 in the Olympics, 4 of them were Finns, and everybody's like, why the Finns? You know, like, I don't think we think that Finns had some genetic advantage.
Right.
I think, frankly, we look for these just so stories, and it's a much more complicated question.
No, which is interesting. Okay, switching over to training. What you describe in the book as you know, some of the state of the art training now is unrecognizable to me. I mean, talk about what some of the pro athletes now.
Sure. So I spent some time actually just down the road here. There's a guy named Phil Wagner who runs a gym called Sparta Sports Science, and he works with. He started working with a lot of baseball players. He also worked a lot with Jeremy Lin before Linsanity. He sort of rebuilt Jeremy as an athlete. Phil has sort of 2 key things that he works on. One is like a very regimented way of evaluating athletic ability, and he does it with force plate analysis. So there's a lot of literature that just doing a vertical jump on a force plate, you can tell a lot about somebody's movement patterns. There are sort of 3 factors. It's how quickly you can move, how long you can sustain a movement, and how much power you generate. Different sports ask for different things, right? We think of athleticism or athletic ability as sort of this global thing, and it's completely not. You look at, you know, an NFL lineman and Lionel Messi and put them up against each other, and like those, they barely look like the same species, let alone people who would compete with one another. Yeah. So one of the real frontiers is that match between your personal athletic ability, the event that you want to get better at. So, you know, when Phil tested me, you get this graph, and he's like, okay, well, what do you want to do?
Right. Yeah.
I'm like, well,
weightlifting.
It's probably not my forte, right? You know, so I've been playing a lot of golf. He's like, okay, well then, you know, that's very rotational. You need to, and in his movement signature, what you need is a longer drive. You need to be able to sustain force as long as possible through that motion. And I'm pretty poor at that, it turns out, which explains a lot, perhaps. So he would prescribe one set of training methods if that's what I wanted to do. If I wanted to play wide receiver, he'd prescribe something that worked on my straight line speed, which actually I'm not bad at. And,
right.
You know,
with a set of exercises.
With a set of exercises, with different lifts, with focusing on different sort of biomechanical chains in the body, sort of like lateral or posterior or anterior. And so you sort of, it's really, it's that level of scientific focus. It's not, it's so far beyond not just like go run. It's not even just like go run intervals.
Not go lift, not go stretch.
It's okay. You know, I got a chance to meet Ashton Eaton, who's the world record holder in the decathlon for this book, and we actually went for a run, and we ran like 2 miles. And it's the longest run he'd done in 5 years. There's no reason for him to ever run more than 2 miles. The longest thing he ever runs in competition is 1,500 meters, right? Yeah. So, you know, it was just one of those funny moments. It's like, oh, like I've run more distance than you do when I go for a run, because like we're not training to do the same thing.
Right. Then you had this great phrase for British cycling, the performance by the aggregation of a whole bunch of incremental gains. It's a performance by aggregation of marginal gains.
Yes. So British cycling is kind of this amazing sports science success story. British cycling sucked forever. They were terrible. They were a laughingstock, and it kind of was embarrassing to them. They didn't like it. And about 15 years ago, the UK started a nationwide lottery. And one of the things that they do with the lottery money is they give millions and millions of dollars to high-performance sport funding and research. So they came upon this huge pile of money and tried to figure out what to do with it. And a couple of people, a guy named David Brailsford, ran British cycling for about a decade. And that's his phrase, performance by the aggregation of marginal gains. And the idea is there aren't any magic bullets anymore, that we've made all the big leaps in performance that we're going to make physically. And that the only way to really find a competitive advantage now is to find lots and lots of little tiny improvements over dozens of things. And so some examples. Before the Olympics, they spent a lot of time with Adidas and some university researchers. Track cyclists, they do a warm-up, and then they go to a holding area before the race. And the temperature in the muscle starts to drop as you sit there waiting for your race, and that's not good. So they developed what they called hot pants, which I love that they called them hot pants. Heated tracksuit bottoms, basically, that had heating elements over the thighs and hamstrings to keep the muscle warm between the warm-up and the race. They travel with their own pillows. Most of us have probably had the experience of sleeping on a bad hotel pillow and waking up and your neck hurts. And that's annoying for us. Like the day before the Olympic final, that's a huge problem, right? Mm-hmm. So you travel with your own pillow. Also, it helps you not get sick. 8% of athletes who competed in London got sick during the Olympics. And that's
got to be a bummer.
That's a bummer, right? You catch a cold the day before your race. It's like, okay, well, so when you talk to these athletes, they won't shake your hand because God only knows where my hand's
right.
So it's really about
business.
It's really about trying to find little improvements. Before every race, they spray isopropyl alcohol on the tires and wipe them down. Just make sure there's no dust on the tires, so they get. Maybe it's 1,000th of a second. Maybe it's nothing, but it can't hurt. And
then now it's gotten, in the book you talk about, it's gotten to the point where there's a cult around, almost, people are, willing to ascribe benefits to the British training approach that might not even be there.
During the Olympics, the French, there's a great rivalry, obviously, and especially in track cycling, and they were killing the French. And the French were complaining, and they were saying, it's really weird. Like after every race, like they take their bikes and they cover the wheels up really quickly. Like, what's up with the wheels? Is there something? What are they hiding from the wheels? And the L'Équipe, which is the French sports daily newspaper, went and asked Brailsford. He's like, yeah, well, they're especially round. and so the headline in L'Équipe the next day was like. Magic or Mavic. Mavic is the French company that makes their wheels.
Yeah.
And they were speculating that perhaps they were especially round wheels.
Yeah.
They were, which, if you believe that they can make a more perfect circle. And that's,
in France? No, sorry. It's get back to the concept of sport-specific training. You have some fun examples of the hammer or the volleyball team.
Yeah. So we don't practice very smartly in most sports. I mean, we do have some advantage, which is we practice sports. And when you think about like the rest of your life, we don't practice most things that we do, right? We just go and do them. Like I don't practice writing and then try and write a story. I just write a story. Yeah. So at least we have something that's separated from the performance aspect. But we aren't very smart about it. A couple of things, since we were talking about basketball, and there's at least some basketball players. Like if you learn how to shoot free throws and you practice free throws in practice, it's probably the coach blows a whistle and everybody lines up and shoots free throws and you sort of rotate around the key, right? Yeah. That's not how you shoot free throws in a basketball game. In a basketball game, you get fouled when you're running around, your heart rate's elevated, and then you shoot 2, maybe 3.
Yeah.
So why on earth are you standing there shooting 100 in a row? You'll never, ever do that when it actually matters. So motor skill learning, which is a thing, talks about random practice, that the best way to practice is to simulate as close as possible the competitive environment, because that's what you actually need to do. So Peter Vint, who works at the USSC, works with some NBA teams, and they now practice free throws just like that. Like they're doing a drill or they're doing something else, and the coach will grab a player and he'll go and shoot 2 free throws and go back to the drill. Because that's how you do it.
It's simulating real game conditions.
The game teaches the game is what one motor skill learning person said to me about it.
So the examples I loved probably most in here were the football examples too, both the small team football and the players, and then the special tool that's helping people with their cognitive football IQ.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I should remember what I wrote about.
Made an impression on me. But
it's so 2 things again on skill acquisition. The term is small-sided games. So basketball gets one-on-one. Playing one-on-one in basketball is really useful. You learn skills that you can apply in a game. Very few team sports have one-on-one being useful. Beach volleyball is 2-on-2 game. What's happened in football recently, especially Texas, has been sort of the epicenter of this, is 7-on-7 football. Is these tournaments, and it's mostly during the summer. It's kind of flag football-ish, but basically quarterbacks will throw 60, 70 passes a game. There's only so many receivers. And it's just tons and tons of reps and tons of seen defenses, and it's tons and tons of catching and throwing footballs. Many more than you would get
Like in a season.
in regular practice. Soccer has its own version of it called futsal, which is incredibly popular in Brazil, and Dan Coyle wrote about this in his book. The other tool is Madden.
So for all you gamers out there.
For all you gamers out there. So EA, where I worked briefly, the average 12-year-old Madden fanatic has seen more professional football plays develop visually than probably a Pro Football Hall of Famer in the 60s did. I mean, if you think about how many, if you play Madden really religiously, play 3 games a night for half a year, that's a lot of pattern recognition. And it takes away one of the huge problems with football, which is concussions and your body getting destroyed as you try and play it. So it's perhaps not surprising that we have this generation of kids running super crazy sophisticated offenses that used to only be run at the pro level, or not even at the pro level, that require a lot of quick decision making by the quarterback. So the read option totally depends on the quarterback seeing the defense and basically reading 1 or 2 things that happen. That used to be like cutting edge stuff. Now, like Piedmont High School is running it. It's crazy, and I really think that a lot of that comes down to having seen so much and being able to have those visual patterns.
Just simulated. They do it for flying planes.
They do it for flying planes. EA's genius is that people pay them for it. Right?
Exactly.
And but they do it for flying planes. They do it for doctors, and I think you've actually started to see some of that. There was a play a couple of years ago. So does anybody here play Madden? And I said, thank you.
Yeah, be proud. Come on, keep them up. Keep them up.
There we go.
Okay,
Okay, so anybody who plays Madden knows what I'm talking about, which is sometimes if time is running out and you're like streaking down the field and you've broken away from everyone, you're going to waste as much time as possible. So you get to the goal line, you sort of run across the goal line before you score a touchdown because you don't want your opponent to get the ball back.
Sounds like Deshaun Jackson, but I'll leave that alone.
Well, so 2 years ago, Eric Decker, who at the time was playing for the Broncos, did that in an NFL game. He got to the goal line and he ran, and it's the sort of thing that anybody who ever played Madden is like, oh yeah, I totally know what he's doing. If you watch the tape of the game, the commentator's like, what is he doing? And it's like, oh well, he's taking time off the clock. Of course he's doing that. And somebody asked him after the game, like Madden, he's like, oh yeah, Madden. When you have that, I mean, that's an amazing, like the simulation.
Durrani, if you'd only known.
This simulation of the sport has fed back into the sport itself. It's kind of
it's interesting. But by the way, a couple of the quarterbacks you mentioned from the Texas Small Football League in the last couple of years.
Luck, Tannehill, RG3.
RG3, just a few.
Guys who grew up in this sort of playing these tournaments where they play 6 games on a weekend and throw 300 passes.
All right, staying with the physical, we're in the shadow of Stanford. That study on sleep was the most interesting.
I love that study. So Sherry Ma is a researcher down the hill at Stanford. We all know sleep. We all intellectually know sleep's important. We also know that culturally, or I would suggest that culturally, we have a really messed up attitude towards sleep. Like the braggadocio is about how little we sleep, and it's crazy. Because it's not just a performance maintainer, it's a performance enhancer. And that was the study that Sherry did. She worked with the men's basketball team. She took baseline sort of performance measurements, how they shot free throws, sprint tests, 3-point shooting. There's one other. On their sort of normal sleep. They were reporting 7 hours of sleep. They were really asleep like 5.5 hours. And then she challenged them to sleep as much as they possibly could. And they started reporting 10. It was really more like 9. Every member of the team ran faster. Every member of the team shot free throws better. Every member of the team shot 3-pointers better. Not
So let's abandon that study now. And sorry. I'm going to the game tonight. As well. We'll see if they slept. Yeah.
I gotta go.
Exactly. Yes, it's time to rest. So
I mean, and these weren't small.
they weren't small
improvements.
These were like 10, 15% improvements.
Yeah.
Didn't the Giants try to do the same thing in the playoffs where they didn't?
So the Giants have been, and I write about this, they've really looked at this. Most teams over the course of the season, their plate discipline decreases. Teams will swing at worse pitches over the course of the year. The Giants, so I don't have data for 2014. In 2012, the Giants' plate discipline got better over the course of this season. They really have focused on that. So several other teams have hired sleep consultants and done some work on that, but the Giants have really.
So speaking of sleep and getting tired, you talk a little bit about athletes who are working to train their brain for being able to perform longer.
So for most of the history of exercise physiology, we've thought like I'm a sports scientist. Sports scientists.
You play one in
Yeah, exactly. I play one in a chair. Fatigue was thought of as something that happened at the muscular level. Peripheral fatigue is the sciencey term for it. So, like, I'm doing bench presses, and eventually my muscles say, like, that's it. Like, there's always been argument about what's that mechanism.
Yeah.
Is it the buildup of lactic acid? Is it like I run out of fuel in the muscle? But the muscle says I'm done, and it's done. The latest research is that that's probably not true. Because at that moment that I can't do that last rep, only 40% of the muscle fibers in that muscle are firing. My brain isn't recruiting everything that it could. And so why not? There are some slightly different theories, but the general idea is that the brain sort of has this idea of what it's going to let my body do. Like if I set out to run 5K, before I take a stride, my brain knows how fast it's going to let me run because its job is to get me to the end of the 5K, not to let me run faster. It just wants to preserve me, right? So if I start out running 5K and halfway through you pull up next to me in your car, it's like, hey, we're going to run 10K today, actually. Yeah. First of all, I'll slow down subconsciously.
Right.
But second of all, I'll still run that 10K faster than I would have if I started off and as knowing I was going to run 10K.
Right.
There's potential there that's untapped. So Sam Markara is a researcher in Wales who's working with UK Sport and also the British military to see if through brain training exercises during physical exercise, can you get the brain to basically fatigue less during exercise and allow your body to do more. And it's such a classic thing. He's like, I'll tell you in 2016 after the Olympics if it works.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Well, there was the one example, the female observer, which you know where this is going.
Social psych experiments are so amazing, right? So all of these research projects take place on college campuses with something like 15 well-trained male students were brought in to run on a treadmill, and they'd run, and there were two conditions. One, there was a male person monitoring. In one condition, a male associate would come in and talk to that person, and in the other condition, a attractive female associate would come in and talk to that person, and every single man ran faster when the attractive. Our brains are, for all that's amazing about our brains, we're so easily manipulated.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're so easily manipulated. If you tell me, some of these deception studies, if you tell me it's a certain temperature in the room, even if it's not. If you tell me it's really hot, I'll go slower. If you tell me, even if it is hot, if you tell me it's not, I'll go faster.
Yeah, which is wild. And then caffeine.
Caffeine's a great drug. Yeah. It's I mean, not just for waking up, but for almost every athlete, the studies are really consistent that caffeine works.
Yeah, no, which is great. Data. That's why I drink data analysis in sports. Dorkapalooza.
So Bill Simmons is a sports writer for Grantland.com now. He dubbed, that's the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference.
Which is supposed to be just really cool.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's 2,000 data nerds talking about sports. So what's cool about it and what's interesting about it, and we all sort of deal with this more than perhaps a lot of people, is the boom in data collection has really caused this problem for our sports organizations and athletes, which is, it used to be really hard to get the information. Now it's really easy to get the information. The trick now is analyzing the information.
What do you do with it?
And especially when you start talking about data sets like SportView, which is a system in the NBA that captures three-dimensional positional data on every player and the ball and officials 25 times a second during a game.
Every player, every game.
Every player, every game.
Yep. Every team.
Every team.
Yep.
25 times a second.
Yeah.
Like that's not, Bill James could sort of revolutionize baseball stats when he was a night watchman at a pork and beans factory in Kansas, because he could do the math. Like to crunch those numbers, you need a data scientist. You need people who are used to like crazy big data sets, and most franchises, frankly, have no idea what to do with this.
So we've met with at least two companies that are taking NBA data and processing it. And it's unbelievably interesting because, first of all, they have to make the data into the players moving.
Right. And
then once they have specific players moving the ball, they can then just start crunching tendencies. Okay, if you push LeBron left on the wing, his shooting percentage goes from 62 to 30.
Right. You want LeBron moving left. You want Kobe to shoot from the left baseline, not the right baseline. So let's start funneling them that way. The granular information, I read about Kirk Goldsberry, who is a Harvard cartologist. Yes. Sorry, I thought I said cardiologist for a second, which is totally different.
Yes,
cartographer is what Kirk is. He started actually by scraping data from ESPN's website before SportView existed, and he was basically just getting shot data for every player, where they took every shot, whether they made it or missed it, and then started mapping it. And it's like, what's the expected value of a shot here versus a shot there? And you see the game changing with these insights. So many teams are running offenses now based around, the three-pointer is a great shot. Yeah. So you see really advanced organizations. The Warriors have really worked on this.
Spurs.
Houston, Spurs. Yeah. Three-pointers, or I want to be at the rim. Mid-range jump shot's a bad shot.
It was used.
Unless you're Dirk.
Yeah. Then some of the stuff, it's just, high pick and roll. How do you play it? And so they can tell you, the guy goes over. This has a 39 centimeters. The guy goes under. This has, and it's just
you can
wild.
see over under
with which players,
over under with which players, with which defensive combination. Yeah. It's we're so at the infancy of this movement because baseball again is where the starting. Baseball's easy because it's state based. Yep. It's very discrete moments. Basketball is continually moving and fluid. Soccer, football, hockey. I mean those team sports. There's a lot to do.
Yeah, they're happening this in soccer too. Cheating. So this Dr. Bob Goldman's question is somewhat provocative.
The Goldman dilemma is what. So Bob was he started doing this questionnaire with athletes, asking them, if you could take a drug that would guarantee you an Olympic gold medal, but you would die in 5 years, would you take it? And crazy percentages said yes. Like 80, 90% said yes. Which is really hard to... It
does explain biking.
It does explain.
What was the age of the athletes?
So they were competitive international athletes, so they were in their 20s, right? What's interesting is, that he started doing this in the 80s. He had a friend who died of a steroid overdose, and he started writing all of this stuff about the scourge and danger of steroids. Oddly, he has become an advocate for life extension and human growth hormone, and he's sort of come in this weird full circle place. Yeah. So those results stayed pretty consistent over time until about 5 years ago. And people have continued asking this question, and the percentage has dropped pretty precipitously, which is good news.
Yeah.
I think we see it for a couple of reasons. It's always hard for testing to keep pace with potential cheating, but I think we're getting better, especially as a cyclist. It's called the biological passport. So instead of trying to catch you and identify a substance in your blood, I'm going to test you at regular intervals, and I'm going to see what your red blood cell count is. And if there are spikes, if there's weirdness, I don't have to
Right.
show, oh, you took something. I can just show, like, this is abnormal.
Yep.
And that's really changed cycling. I think the culture has really changed in a lot of sports over the past few years. I think all the revelations in cycling finally sort of broke that culture of silence
Yeah,
around
the
it.
Tyler Hamilton book's unbelievable.
The Tyler Hamilton book is insane. I mean, it's, if you haven't read it, you care about this stuff. It's an amazing, heartfelt, devastating book about choices that he felt like he had to make.
Had to make it.
So it's really easy to make really extreme arguments on doping, and
Yeah.
I've made some of them in the past, like, oh, just let anybody do anything,
Yeah.
because at least you can be sort of internally consistent. In sort of thinking about it more and talking to people, to argue by analogy, which is a terrible way to argue, but that would be like saying, like, if somebody gets away with murder, then we should just make murder legal. It's okay, right? Part of it is because sports are arbitrary. There's no reason we have to do any of this. So we feel there's obviously a moral difference between cheating in a sport and killing someone. But it's also this, it's not about catching the cheat. It's about protecting the ability of the clean athlete to be competitive. I shouldn't have to make that choice to be competitive.
Yep.
And so whatever we can do to protect that ability, I think is worth doing.
And go for it.
Why beet juice and caffeine? Why are they okay? But
It's a really good question. I mean, and the answer is because we decided that they are. So
it's arbitrary.
but it's all arbitrary, right? It could be 92 feet to first base or 85 feet to first base. Red blood cells, just another example of that, right? So we're totally cool with people living at altitude because we don't feel like we should let people. Okay, so how about a hypoxic tent? If I spend 15 grand, I can build a room in our house, and Kristen might not like living at altitude every night, but like we can sit there and be.
You may be in the tent by yourself,
Yeah, we
big
can.
guy, so
We can be
just so,
slightly lightheaded and generate more red blood cells, or I can blood dope. I can take my own blood out and spin out the red blood cells and put them back in. Or, so I'm doing this in what I think is the order of badness. Or I can blood dope with somebody else's blood, that's detectable at least. Or I can take EPO. They all had the same effect on my
Same
body.
mechanism.
The same outcome,
Yeah.
different degrees of the same outcome, but the same outcome. And we're okay with some when we're not with others. The World Anti-Doping Agency actually looked into banning altitude tents. And they had that conversation for a long time. And in talking to some of these altitude researchers, one thing that came up was like, look, if you're going to ban an altitude tent, you're going to have to ban Gatorade. And so the answer is it is all arbitrary. But we sort of decide, I think part of it goes to risks, like physical risks. There are no physical risks to too much beet juice. There's some to caffeine, but you really have to work at it. There are profound physical risks to EPO. And so I think that's part of it. I think part of it is accessibility of the technology to a broad swath of people. So, everybody can sort of source beet juice, unless you're in London in 2012. So I think those are some of the factors that feed into that. But it is, at the end of the day, it's just we decide on a set of rules and ask everybody to follow them.
I had a mini version of this. I was this summer, spent 3 straight weeks in the mountains biking, came back, and my time improved by
Came back and you crushed
8-9%.
Yeah.
And it was just because I have these these sparkers. I'm just like, oh my god.
It does help to have more red blood cells on the bike.
It was pretty good. So the past century has seen this massive improvement, but in many sports, the rate is slowing down. In some cases, sports haven't even gotten back to the cheated records and things like that.
Yeah, well, I mean,
So are we reaching our natural limits?
yes and or no but. In some ways, we are. I mean, just for the mathematicians, the curve's flattening out, right? Our improvement is slowing. It's not stopping. Logically, you come to a point where you think there has to be a limit. But one of the people I was talking to for the book, his name's Andy Walsh. He runs Red Bull. Actually, runs this giant high-performance athletic program. They sponsor hundreds of athletes around the world.
Were we talking about caffeine before? Or is it, yeah, sorry, it's.
I was talking to Andy Walsh, is his name. He came from, he's Australian and worked with the U.S. ski team. I'm like, well, nobody's ever going to run 100 meters in 8 seconds. He's like, why not? I'm like, well, because you can't. He's like, well, so think of Neanderthal man and think of where we are now and think of that level of improvement. And he's like, and just start to project that forward, right? And he's like,
Evolution hypothesis.
Yeah. Right? And so his line was, somebody will run 100 meters in 6 seconds. They just won't look anything like what we think human beings look like today.
Like Usain Bolt, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but Bolt's a great example, right? Like everybody always thought sprinters had to be short.
Yeah.
Turns out they don't.
They don't, yeah. Which is good. What I'm going to open up to questions after this. So be thinking, what interesting trends are you seeing now that you think have that are worth watching go forward?
I mean, I keep coming back to just we're actually really far behind in the U.S. on a lot of this. And so seeing some of the things that have happened in Australia and the U.K. make their way into major U.S. team sports, I think we're going to see a lot of changes in NBA, NFL.
You haven't mentioned what Australia is doing. That came up in the book repeatedly.
Yeah, I mean, it's Australia really, so a lot of this really started in the 70s and 80s in Eastern Bloc countries. And then Australia, after the 76 Olympics, founded the Australian Institute of Sport, and they really drove a ton of innovation to and through the 2000 Games at Sydney. Companies have come out of that. There's a company called Catapult, some of you might be familiar with. They make a little GPS, they make a little sensor units, GPS, accelerometer, gyros, it's like 20 sensors, and it sits sort of in between your shoulder blades. Not that anybody else is watching Australian sports, but if you do, sometimes you'll see like rugby players with this little like thing protruding between their shoulders, and they have a little pocket where it's sewn in. They're using that data in real time. So coaches are making decisions on substitution patterns based on what they're seeing from the data. So not like, Jeff, how do you feel? But like, oh, Jeff's initial 10-yard sprint time has gone down 10%. He needs a break because he's not able to cover this winger with that speed.
So we're 2 minutes into the game.
We're 2 minutes. Yeah, exactly. The game has just started. So literally they're sitting there with an app that's suggesting, here's the load that a player has undergone, and here's what we should do with it.
And here's the impact. The World Cup said he's run 6 miles, but it doesn't say how the speed has changed over the 6 miles.
So none of the U.S. team sports has allowed any of that yet. Some of the biggest pushback is from the players' unions, because now I can evaluate. Many of them are using them in practice.
So regulation, again, limiting technology. Sorry.
Not is that a thing down here?
Nah.
So I think, but the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages, and eventually they'll come to an understanding with the unions. But they're worried that they're going to, like, your next contract time, it's going to be like, yes, but look, here's the data.
So all the concussion technology we've seen 20 different approaches to concussion management, and the players' union's like, yeah, stay away. Yeah. Which is interesting. Questions? Yeah, Mark.
I'm curious what your comments are. Players are getting bigger too, it seems, right? You mentioned Dirk and LeBron, Durant, or tight ends in football.
Yeah.
Is that bigger people entering sports?
I think we are. David Epstein, who wrote another great book about sports science last year called The Sports Gene, talked about it as the Big Bang of body types. It used to be, there are these amazing studies on morphology done over the course of the Olympic Games, like people literally going in and like taking measurements of Olympic athletes. And in the 20s, that range was very small. Like if you plotted height, weight, it was a pretty small range in every sport. Now today it's like this. It's so atomized. So I think part of it is just increased training proficiency. I think a big part of it is better nutrition worldwide, just getting people to sort of fulfill their genetic potential physically. And part of it is, I think every sport has sort of pushed to some of the extremes of that morphology, just because the competitive landscape drives. You can't be competitive anymore as, again, you watch those now 60s NFL games, like the offensive linemen, like the huge guys on the field are the size of like
The tailbacks.
Not even, right? I mean, like 6'2", 230 was like a big guy back then, and that's not a big guy anymore in the NFL.
Do you have a question? I thought you raised your hand, sorry.
I can ask one.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Well, I'm very interested in wearables right now, as are a lot of people. And I'm curious, oh no, that's okay, I'll be loud, thank you. I'm curious whether or not you think that this sort of consumer revolution in wearable technology is sort of an adequate slice of what we're seeing professionals do with technology. Because it's being marketed as that.
No,
it's being marketed as,
yeah.
measure your sleep with your wristband, and then, but here we have, professionals guiding our teams about sleep.
I think most of the stuff on the market right now is still fundamentally a toy and a hobby. I mean, there are going to be these steps, but to get really good data, the sensors are bigger and more annoying and bulkier right now. Or to have something that looks okay to wear, they're smaller and the data is not as good, right? So we're a long way. I mean, I think they're better than nothing. I think capturing information is always better than not capturing information, but nobody at the professional level is relying on a tool like Fitbit or Up or FuelBand.
Gerald.
I just to piggyback off that question, I did read or hear about some NBA teams this year using chips actually on the players to monitor them throughout the season. I wonder where it really come into play with privacy for the athletes. I mean, I know guys that thought going out at night help them play better than them. Not me. Where will
I think
We'll see that tomorrow morning. Well, yeah. It's,
I think those are huge questions. I think that's why the players' unions are really pushing back on this, right? I mean, there's so little privacy for a professional athlete anyway that they're worried about that. The teams that are, using that stuff now mostly are using them for practices and not sort of 24/7. But yeah, once I sign you to an $80, $100 million contract, am I going to want to know everything about your life? I probably am, and that's a tough negotiation, I think.
yeah.
We have a great example of extreme performance in sports here recently. Madison Bumgarner,
Oof.
7 in the World Series. Like, we haven't seen a performance like that in 100 years, if ever.
If ever.
What do you attribute that to?
It's, I mean, I can't attribute it to anything other than, like, that's why we watch sports, right? We watch sports to see, like, if you watch sports really, really carefully, every game you will see something you've never seen before. And every game will offer you a moment of, oh my God, did that just happen? And it can be as small as a crossover move. It can be as large as Bumgarner coming out and throwing 70-some pitches on 2 days rest to say, I mean, it's crazy what he did, right? It's nuts. And that's why it's not academic. That's why we cheer and yell and jump up and down and don't just hand in a spreadsheet at the start and say, I trained more and here's my physiology and so I'm better. Like there's right? I mean, that's like if you take the 10,000 hours thing to its reductionist, most absurd point, there would be no point of running a race. Just show me your training log and I'll tell you who's going to win.
That's why they play the game.
That is right,
exactly.
and you get, it's so hard to not sound super cliched as you say this, but like that's why we care.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's just it's just this thing that happens.
What are your thoughts on anti-aging programs like Cenegenics?
I will be honest that I don't know a super ton about them, so I don't want to speak terribly authoritatively. I mean, there's some really interesting research on sort of ways to keep the ongoing genetic damage that we all suffer as our cells replicate over time, to lessen that through different interventions and that sort of telomere decay that we all have. Exercise is one thing that shows that. Like, a lot of times people are like, oh, professional athletes don't live that long. And there are certainly cases that we can point to and tragic cases, but generally as a population, elite athletes do live longer than the rest of us, even with what their bodies have been put through. So I can't really speak to any specifics on a specific plan, but
the reason I mention it is I did this race in October, which is Gran Fondo.
pretty brutal race, 9,400 feet of climb, 103 miles.
Which one?
The Levi's race.
Oh, okay. So Coleman Valley Road and all the fun up there.
That was actually the easy part.
Yeah.
But the gentleman who had competed is 18 years older than me.
Mhm.
He was able to, keep pace with me the entire time. Performed quite well, and I found out later on he was on this cytogenetic program, which is administered by medical physicians.
Right.
It's a lot of data sampling, DNA testing. There are things like human growth hormone and testosterone that are administered, but done so legally. His performance was amazing.
I mean, look, HGH and testosterone freaking work. I mean, there's no doubt that those anabolic agents are incredibly powerful. They're legal, they're legal prescribed by a physician and not in a competitive environment. So yeah, in that case, he can do that. We haven't really talked about personalization, but that's one thing. It's like that testing in everything from nutrition to training programs. We're like, oh yeah, we're all different, we're all individuals, but we are crazily so. So the population in this room, 65 or 70. There are 5 of us in this room, likely, who are very low responders to aerobic exercise, like who can only see less than 5% improvement to our VO2 max through whatever we do forever. There are likely 5 of us who are incredibly high responders to aerobic exercise, 20+% gain to VO2 max. That's a huge delta in a really small population. So, we know this intuitively. 2 of us go on the same training program and have very different results. And the reason is genetic. Yeah.
So my wife is German-American, and we've had many discussions over soccer.
Okay.
I have this theory that the U.S. soccer program is not better because our best athletes don't play soccer.
Yep.
What's your take on that?
You're right.
So it's not that we're behind. We could just get our best athletes to play.
I mean, yeah. I mean, to a large extent, yes. Yeah. I mean, it's you should. Yeah. I'll give her a ring after when we're having drinks. Give me the phone. I'll tell her you're totally right. We're starting. It's going to be interesting, right? Like, there are 2 facets. One is obviously the athletes, and our best athletes don't play soccer. More and more are. I think in 10 years, I'd be short NFL right now if I were a betting man, because I think we're going to start taking a harder and harder look at the consequences of playing American football.
30 years ago, boxing was one of the top 3 sports.
Yeah. So, I think we'll start to see some of those athletes shift. I think, obviously, we know all the youth participation numbers in soccer. That's never really translated to anything at the world stage. We're getting better. Klinsmann's actually great, because what Klinsmann's actually worked on is not at the elite level, but trying to build the infrastructure.
He's a German.
He's a German.
I just thought
Yeah,
I'd
I
point
know.
that out. Yeah.
But he's trying to build, he's trying to build the system. Part of it is identifying those athletes and making sure that they're starting to play and getting them into the system. Discoverability of a great athlete is, in a country our size, is a problem.
Just a couple more questions.
So, the question I had was around, to what extent does, everything that you've seen on this topic lead to a general slippery slope towards just straight up genetic interventions? And, if we are going to get faster, stronger, whatever, where does it end? And do we eventually get there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's so near the end of the book, the last chapter is on the limits of performance, and Mark Denny, who's another Stanford guy, wrote this kind of amazing paper looking at the rates of improvement in 3 sports: human track and field, thoroughbred horse racing, greyhound racing. Obviously, we're very comfortable running a straight-up genetics breeding program for speed in horses and dogs. Those sports have plateaued. Like, horses haven't gotten any faster since the 70s, statistically. I mean, you get some variation. Same with greyhound racing. I am so massively unqualified to have a medical ethics discussion about sort of how we'll get to sort of genetic modifications for these things. I guess I would just caution that the idea that there are easy genetic answers to these questions, height, we know height to be 60% genetically determined, roughly, 70, between 60 and 70. So that's easy to know. What the specific alleles are, what the SNPs are, that's impossible. And there's something on the order of 30,000 that have been identified that have some association, right? So we can know that there are genetic factors against these things. Our ability to even begin to touch or modify those factors today, of course, today is non-existent. God only knows where we'll end up.
In the book, the odds of playing in the NBA go up massively with each inch.
So if you're 7 feet tall, so first of all, being 7 feet tall is really, really crazily super rare. But if you're a 7 foot tall American male, you have roughly a 25% chance of playing in the National Basketball Association. If you are 6'6", which again is really tall, you have like a 0.2% chance of playing in the NBA. Like that's how steep that curve gets at the bottom, right? So,
and if you're 6'1", sorry,
if you're 6'1", I mean, how are you moving to the left, right?
6'1" and over 50.
Anything in the back, it's
all day long,
Go.
Youth sports.
Yes.
So focus on travel teams, specialization.
Please don't.
Any correlation at all?
No, it's
with injury.
Negative, high correlation with injury and negative correlation with elite success later in life. Is the short answer. The slightly longer answer is this is one of the real scourges of 10,000 hours, right? Is this idea that I need my kid to pick a sport early and really practice it hard. It can work, right? But Eric Heiden. But Tiger Woods, right. Read. There's your cautionary tale, right? but read Agassi's autobiography on how he felt about tennis. There's actually been good research on this. Most Olympic athletes specialize late. You have a much better chance of finding a sport, A, that you enjoy playing, which fundamentally is really what we should all be focused on, because statistically it's a rounding error if you're an elite. The other part is you get a better match between your body and the sport. I grew up as a cyclist. Maybe I would have been a great soccer player. I don't know. I never played soccer. That sampling period is really important. So please,
That's fine. Great. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate the conversation. Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure.